So, hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I'm looking forward to this session. So my name is Joanna Redden. I'm an associate prof at Western University in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies. I co-direct the Data Justice Lab, and my research and my work has involved looking at the social and political implications of government uses of data systems, specifically predictive analytics, AI, and automated decision-making systems, as they're called all those different things. I wanted to talk to you today, and I'll start by sharing my screen. What I thought I would talk to you about today was research that I've been doing on data harms. So this work has involved a few things. I don't have, right, let me go back to the beginning. All right. So Calvin, if anybody has any questions or comments, can you just give a shout or let me know if there's something in the chat I need to pay attention to?
Sure. Do you have a preference to wait till the end, or do you mind if people ask in the middle?
Ask in the middle. I thought we'd run this, I guess, like a small seminar. I mean, ideally we'd be in person, but that can't happen. So if you have any questions or comments as I go through, what I wanted to do was just present the work for the first part, and then I'm going to open it up for some discussion in the latter part of the presentation. I'm going to shoot to do this overview within about 40 minutes. So hopefully we'll have a chunk of time at the end to also take things in different directions, depending on your interests. So, right. So the what I wanted to talk to you about today is the research that we've been doing at the Data Justice Lab on data harms. This research has been published in different ways. So most recently, it's in this chapter, this co-authored chapter, this co-authored book chapter in this book focuses on the data harm research that we've been doing. The data harm record itself is published online. You can access it in on our Data Justice Lab website. And then an article was published a couple of years ago in Scientific American. Now, the idea behind the data harm record was that when we started the record in 2016, when people were talking about, and the term then was big data, when people were talking about big data across corporate and government publications, presentations, you would see a language used that with big data comes opportunity and risk. You see the same thing happening now with AI. With AI comes great opportunity and also great risk. And what we were seeing, because of the early publications coming out of the US in particular, we were identifying that people were being harmed already by different kinds of data applications. And it was very clear to me that actually this language of risk is problematic. To frame this debate as if we must attend to both opportunity and risk, the language of risk is problematic because risk suggests that something might happen, that harm might occur, that this might be something that would happen in the future, whereas what we were seeing was that harm was already occurring. And if you start by recognizing that these systems are already causing harm, then that'll lead you to do different kinds of things. And so therefore, we stress with the data harm record how important it is to pay attention to and keep track of the different ways in which people are already being negatively affected by different kinds of data systems. And the idea here is that if we can gain a better appreciation, a better big picture appreciation of the different ways in which people are being negatively affected, then we as people living in communities, living in our societies, we have an opportunity to change course. Then we can come together and we can make decisions about what we think should or should not be done in relation to the kind of the uses of different kinds of data systems. The data harm record also draws our attention to the really important question of, how do socio-technical transformations impact on people's rights, life chances, and well-being? Because it is informed by also a premise. The central premise is that we need to be paying attention to the social justice implications of socio-technical transformations. As we know, the way that technology is developed and implemented is not inevitable. We have an opportunity to intervene, and in fact, we should be intervening far more than we are in debates about if, where, and how technological systems, particularly AI and automated decision-making systems, are being used. We're in a critical moment at this moment in time, because once data systems, particularly predictive analytics systems, particularly AI, automated decision-making systems, or decision support systems, once these things are implemented, it becomes very difficult to change course, right? So it's really important that we begin to be having far more critical debates than we are. And the idea here is that we can work together collectively to move from societies where we're seeing so much of what we call data harms to better futures for everyone, where everyone has an opportunity to thrive and to flourish. Okay, so defining data harm and thinking about data harms also involves paying attention to the way in which we are talking about harm. Often, as you'll see in legislation, when people try to, when people regulate in relation to data practices, harm is always often limited to individual harm. So harm that focuses on the individual, which is really problematic. As we go through, you'll see when I'm sure you're having these conversations already, but we can already see ways in which societies are being collectively harmed by certain kinds of systems. So we would argue that we need to think about harm that as it relates to individuals, communities, and societies more broadly. Harm, as Sullivan Citron have pointed out, can be connected to impairment. We can think about harm as setting the interests of a person, a community, or a society back. Citron and Pasquale have argued that we should be thinking about data harms as a person, a community, or society being when harm occurs when a person, a community, or society is worse off as a result of a data-related practice. Hoffman and Ahua have argued that actually we should be talking more about data violence or algorithmic violence because of how significant these harms are. In fact, we're looking at, in many cases, violence being done to people, to communities and societies. The data harm record then, what we did is we started in 2016, building a record of all the accounts that we could find, all the published accounts where specific harms were referenced. We looked at, we looked to the media, we did literature reviews, we did document analysis, and then we sorted those harms. We tried to organize them. So harms that would be like other harms, we kind of grouped together in an attempt to try to better see if we could identify patterns, right? Could we identify similarities in the kinds of harms that were being experienced? We also did case study investigations. So this involved investigations that relied upon interviews with people involved in trying to redress data harm. So often the people that we were talking to would be lawyers, activists, in some cases politicians, individuals who had experienced either experienced harm or who had come together in coalitions to try to challenge or redress the harms that had occurred, and then take that knowledge and work to trying to ensure that harms would not occur in the future. So we did case study investigations that involved talking to people and looking at documents, legal documents primarily in the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And the research that I'm going to talk about today is pulling out some cases from the data harm record and from some of the work that we've done, and pointing to key work by others. Taxonomies are problematic. There's overlap, of course, but in general, as we went through and tried to look at what kind of harms were occurring, we found examples of exploitation. We found examples where people's data was being used against them in different kinds of ways, and leading to them being targeted with different types of exploitive practices. And I'll talk about an example of that in a minute. We found a lot of examples of discrimination where data systems were being used in ways that discriminated against people. We saw a number of examples of loss of privacy, real concern about data breaches. We saw examples where surveillance, so for example, the putting in place of workplace surveillance systems were being used to control workers, for example, or leading to physical injury because the implementation of workplace surveillance was then pushing people to do more work than they were physically able to because of this omnipresent surveillance. We found examples of manipulation, and we can think a lot about, or we might even want to talk about the way in which data is being used to try to manipulate people. Of course, this has been in the news over the last several years in relation to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? We can think about the way in which data is being used to try to either discourage voter participation, to try to suppress votes in some cases, to try to manipulate information to get people to either take part in the election process or not take part in the election process. We saw examples where data systems were wrongly excluding people from necessities of life. And again, I'll provide some examples of this. And injustices, different kinds of injustices. And if you're interested in looking at the data harm record in more detail, it's online, as I mentioned, or you can check out the Scientific American article is free and posted online too. Okay, so I'm going to talk through a few of these examples from the record. The first one on the top of your screen there, that points to World Privacy Forum's Pam Dixon. She was among the first to raise concerns about how data brokers were collecting highly personal data and using it to sort and categorize people so that perceived vulnerabilities could be capitalized upon. We know that data brokers collect information about people and then package it into content that can be sold to others, for example, by compiling lists that can be used by companies to target advertising. The problem is that people often don't know that the data they produce as they make use of a dating site, for example, is being vacuumed up by data brokers. And people don't know many details about the kinds of lists that are being compiled, right? The way in which they're being potentially added to lists that are really exploitive. So in her testimony to Congress, Dixon details what kind of information about people was being collected, combined, and sold. She reported finding data brokers selling lists of rape victims, addresses of domestic violence shelters, people suffering from genetic diseases, and struggling with addiction. In 2015, the American Federal Trade Commission reported that it had charged a data broker with illegally selling the financial data of those applying for payday loans. Another type of exploitive practice was identified by Julia Angwin and colleagues when she was working at ProPublica. So their investigation found car insurance companies charging higher insurance rates for those living in neighborhoods populated by minorities versus white neighborhoods with similar accident and risk rates. In short, Angwin et al. Found that contrary to insurance company claims, the data didn't support the rates being charged to those living in these neighborhoods. And of course, those of us in North America know how much this matters, because when you're struggling on minimum wage or just above minimum wage, and you depend on your vehicle to get to work, when you live in a place with no public transit or with very poor public transit, as is the case with many rural communities in North America, access to a vehicle is essential for work. So they found people foregoing other necessities because of the high cost of insurance. Joy Bulamwini's research has demonstrated that facial recognition technologies have problems identifying people with darker skin. Bulamwini and Timnit Gebru's tests of facial recognition systems found misrecognition was tied to skin color and gender, with darker skinned females being the group of people most misclassified. The American Civil Liberties Union tested Amazon's recognition system on members of Congress and found that mismatches were common, and also that people of color in Congress were 2 times as likely to be misidentified as a potential criminal than their white colleagues. The use of these technologies is particularly threatening to people of color, as noted by ACLU's Jacob Snow, who documented a terrible case where a woman was wrongly pulled over because of a recognition system that wrongly identified her car as being stolen and was forced to kneel at gunpoint. Bulamwini has also pointed out that these systems become even more problematic the more they are integrated into governmental processes. We know that misidentification due to the use of facial recognition technology has already led to wrongful arrest and detention. Nigeer Parks was one of the people who has been wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit due to the use of facial recognition and a system that misidentified him. He spent 10 days in jail and $5,000 in legal costs before the case was dismissed due to a lack of evidence. So I thought we could hear from Bulamwini a bit before moving on. So if you're not familiar with her work, it's been hugely influential, and I thought we should listen to her talk a little bit about the work she's done and how she's gone about that work.
Hi, I'm Joy, and I research how computers detect, recognize, and classify people's faces. In my TED featured talk, I spoke about my experience with the coded gaze, my term for algorithmic bias. The system I was using worked well on my lighter skinned friend's face, but when it came to detecting my face, it didn't do so well until I put on a white mask. After my talk was posted, I tested my speaker image profile across different facial analysis demos. 2 of the demos didn't detect my face. The other 2, well, they misgendered me. The demos didn't even distinguish between gender identity and biological sex. They just provided 2 labels, male and female. Now I wanted to see if these results were just because of my unique facial features, or if this was something that was more of a pattern across other faces too. So I began a project that became my MIT thesis, Gender Shades, or the long title, Gender Shades, Intersectional Phenotypic and Demographic Evaluation of Face Data Sets and Gender Classifiers, or just Gender Shades. I wanted to see how well different gender classification systems worked across different people's faces, and if the results changed based on somebody's gender or their skin type. I created a data set of over 1,000 images of parliament members ranked among the top 10 in the world based on their representation of women in power. To get at a range of skin types, I chose 3 African countries and 3 European countries, so I could see how the system performed on lighter skin and darker skin. Then I chose 3 companies to evaluate: IBM, Microsoft, and Face++, which has access to one of the largest data sets of Chinese faces. So now with the data set and the companies, I decided to run a test. The companies appear to have relatively high accuracy overall. Microsoft performed best, achieving 94% accuracy on the whole data set. All companies perform better on males than females, and all companies also perform better on lighter subjects than on darker subjects. When we analyzed the results by 4 subgroups, we saw that all companies performed worst on darker females. IBM and Microsoft performed best on lighter males, and Face++ performed best on darker males compared to the others. IBM had the largest gap in accuracy, with a difference of 34% in error rates between lighter males and darker females. I was surprised to see multiple commercial products failing on over 1 in 3 women of color. In fact, as we tested women with darker and darker skin, the chances of being correctly gendered came close to a coin toss. While more research is needed to explore the specific reasons for the accuracy differences, one general issue is the lack of diversity in training images and benchmark data sets. Failure to separate accuracy results across traits like gender and skin type also makes it harder to identify differences. Companies should do better with commercially sold products, especially since the machine learning techniques that have made gender classification possible are applied to other domains of computer vision, like facial recognition, and other areas of artificial intelligence, like predictive analytics. Predictive systems can help determine who is hired, granted a loan, or what information a particular individual sees. These data-centric technologies are vulnerable to bias and abuse. As a result, we must demand more transparency and more accountability. We have entered the age of automation overconfident yet underprepared. If we fail to make ethical and inclusive artificial intelligence, we risk losing gains made in civil rights and gender equity under the guise of machine neutrality. The coded gaze reflected in the Gender Shades project must be faced.
And there are more examples in the data harm record, which I won't go through here. Some of these stories you're probably familiar with, others you may not be. In short, the point being made here, and there's a large body of research underpinning this point. Some of it, I'm sure you're familiar with. Many of you might be familiar with a lot of it. But the point, of course, is that these systems impact all of us, but they're not impacting all of us equally. I wanted to turn now to look at robo-debt, because a lot of these systems, if we think about government practices, a lot of these systems are being implemented to risk assess people. A lot of the types of systems that I've been talking about are being implemented for fraud detection. But before I do that, can I get a sense of how many people here have heard about the robo-debt case in Australia? Do you want to raise your hands, thumbs up? Because that'll just affect how in detail I go. Okay, great. All right. I will go then in more detail. Okay, so the story here starts in 2016 when the Department of Human Services and Centrelink, which manages social security payments in Australia, changed the way that it identified if people had been overpaid their benefits. Now, the range of people captured here is enormous, right? We can think about students who relied on benefits when they were going to school. We can think about single mothers. We can think about people who rely on disability payments for health or disability related issues. We can think about people who are out of work for a short period of time. A huge number of people were affected by this. So what they did is the new method of of calculation meant fortnightly earnings could be used to estimate annual earnings. Now, this is a problem for many people who work seasonally, who work precariously, who are students, who work part-time, who have poor health, because of the way the income of these people, it fluctuates. The automation of the system was another key change. So previously, when a person was flagged as being overpaid benefits, a human would investigate to ensure that that flag was in fact correct, that there was a problem here. They removed that element, and those flagged by the system were automatically sent debt notices. At one point, the system went from sending out 20,000 debt notices a year to 20,000 a week. Further, another change meant that it became the responsibility of those receiving the debt notices to prove that the system was wrong. Now, that's a significant challenge in this case, because it was difficult for those who had been sent one of these debt notices to find out more information about their case, why they had been flagged. If they tried to call Centrelink, if they tried to get someone on the phone, sometimes they would have to wait for hours, and still, in some cases, not be able to get anyone on the phone to find out about their case. There were widespread errors. During a Senate hearing, one social service organization reported that 1/4 of the debt notices it investigated were wrong. While all of this is happening, people's lives were being destroyed. For people already living paycheck to paycheck or struggling with health conditions, being hounded by debt collectors created intense stress and anxiety. Asher Wolf is one of the activists who challenged the system and organized the Not My Debt campaign. She has described the system, which has been called robo-debt, as an algorithmic weapon of calculated political cruelty because of the negative impact it had on those falsely accused, and because of the way it disproportionately targeted the unemployed, disabled people, single parents, caregivers, casual and gig economy workers. And that's a quote. So and this is another important point about the data harm record. So I think that sometimes when we hear about all these stories, I think that we recognize how tragic this is, how important these stories are, how important it is that we pay attention to them, how important it is that we work to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. But I guess a key point I want to make, and we're trying to make with this research, is not to disempower, right? We know about these cases because of the work of people like Wolf and other activists in Australia who mobilized, who created the Not My Debt campaign, who worked to get media attention on the story, who worked to mobilize politicians, who worked to mobilize civil society organizations. There was a huge kind of coalition emerged around this story. In this case, people published their stories anonymously to share information. People tried to get personal stories into the press to try to convey the harm that was happening, the way that people were being negatively affected. We had a lot of really important critical media coverage. Others made important arguments. We had data scientists intervening here in really important ways, talking about what kind of steps should have been taken before a system like this was introduced. Lawyers came forward. So we had Victoria Legal Aid mounted a legal case, which eventually would be successful. And one of the key points made by Dan Nicholson of Victoria Legal Aid when we talked to him was that he was identifying that what you see happening with the automation of these kinds of systems and what happened in Australia, a similar situation is happening in the United States, has happened in the United States. What we're seeing happen with these systems is a change in the relationship between citizens and the state, right? So one of the things that Nicholson pointed out is that you have happening in a case like this, the state unreasonably shifting the onus onto an individual to prove their innocence, right? So instead of the state having to prove that there was in fact something fraudulent going on, in cases like this, with this kind of automation, what you have happening is it now becomes the responsibility of the individual, who has far less resources than the state, to prove that they are innocent. And that's a fundamental shift that Nicholson says we need to be paying attention to. So after years of activism and advocacy, the federal government conceded in 2019 that the automated debt recovery system it had introduced was flawed. Government communications suggested that anywhere from 600,000 to 900,000 robo-debts had been issued to people, and that these would need to be reassessed. There had already been numerous investigations of the system. In 2020, the government agreed to pay $1.2 billion to settle a class action lawsuit. Another system I don't have too much time to talk about, but I'll share my slides with Calvin and he can share them with you. This system was established in Little Rock, Arkansas. In this case, the government automated the way that home care hours were allocated and calculated. So what used to happen is that a home care nurse would assess how many home care hours each person required. In 2016, this changed as the Department of Human Services decided that an algorithmic system would assess need and make the decision about how many home care hours each person would receive. Home care nurses could administer the necessary questionnaire and enter the data into the algorithmic system, but they were not able to challenge the decision made by the algorithm. For many, the new system led to a drastic cut in hours, which led to tragedy as people saw their quality of life attacked. As just one example, the drastic cut in home care hours meant people with mobility limitations were left to languish in their beds for extended periods. Some people were no longer able to remain in their own home. Legal Aid of Arkansas's Kevin DeLeban began investigating the algorithm on behalf of clients who had been negatively affected, who then took the state to court. And they challenged the system. Through legal pressure, he was able to access the algorithm, which enabled him to identify major problems with it. For example, that it didn't accurately recognize conditions like cerebral palsy and diabetes. There again, here we see significant advocacy and mobilization. So I've got the link to the news story in the slides. There was an excellent 4-part series produced by local news, where people who were affected, those who were advocating and mobilizing and politicizing this, came together to talk about what was going on and tell others what was happening. Eventually, in that case, there was a pause because a judge ordered the DHS to stop using the system. They then tried to put in place a different kind of system. It led to political mobilization. But after an extended period, that system was stopped. Again, another case. In this case, with the system risk my Dutch is not good. System risk indication is the blunt English translation. In this case, in the Netherlands, the government put in place, again, a risk assessment fraud detection system that was, the aim was to assess risks of welfare abuse and tax fraud. That system led to harm as people were falsely flagged or denied access to benefits. A coalition of groups came together to challenge the system in court. And after a number of years, in April 2020, that system was abandoned after it was found to be unlawful and not compliant with Article 8, Paragraph 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. I will leave this oh no, I told this is only a 2-minute clip. I'm going to play this for you. So Kathy O'Neill, in her book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, documents a number of similar cases, similar situations where we're seeing algorithmic systems, we're seeing automated systems being introduced that are having negative effects on people, that are damaging people's lives. We're seeing the implementation of automated scoring systems being applied to assess teacher performance in the United States, right? We're seeing the introduction of predictive policing systems across the US that are leading to an over surveillance and criminalization of poor neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods. And one of the key points that she raises in her book is that we need to be recognizing and identifying that these systems are causing massive destruction. Also, that we need to be thinking about far more than we are, and talking about far more than we are, the democratic implications of these systems.
And these algorithms, I've only mentioned 3, are a set of secret rules. They don't affect everyone. Other algorithms that I look at in my book correspond to getting a job at hourly wage grad jobs and the workplace personality tests that people are subjected to, having a job, the surveillance on the job, that just-in-time scheduling, that all use big data, and they all punish certain people and not others. So one thing I want to think about when we think about civic tech is that we have a destructive force. We have lots of great ideas. We have things that improve lives for the many. But we also have these other things, which I've been discussing, weapons of mass destruction, that sort of, they make certain people, certain subpopulations suffer in unreasonable ways. So we have to sort of add these effects up. And what we see is unequal effects of technology and modeling, especially if you're a minimum wage worker. I also want to make the point that Corey made to me when I talked to him last night. These are all really hard problems. Like, how do you get education better? Like, how do you decrease mass incarceration? Many of these things are really, truly good intentioned, gone awry. The things that happened before the value-added model for teachers was you just got every teacher who didn't have enough passing students in trouble, right? But that was clearly, on the face of it, unfair to teachers of struggling students. So they replaced it with this model, but it's actually not better. In fact, it's harder to understand, and that makes it harder to acknowledge that it's failing. So there's lots of good intentions here that aren't succeeding. We have to think about how to solve those problems as a society, and not how to rely on sort of obscure mathematical answers that actually don't pan out. My final statement is that this is not, for me, a question of privacy. The teachers I'm talking about, the prisoners I'm talking about, the people who are trying to get a job, the people who have a job, none of them they don't even have the right to privacy in those contexts. This is really about social justice. This is about understanding how these algorithms, which are secret rules, affect them in their lives, and lower or open up the options to them and to all of us. Thank you very much.
So I would like us to hold this just for a second, because I'm almost at the end here and I just want to get to the end. So let's hold this in our heads for just a moment. So we've been talking about, and I've been kind of providing examples to demonstrate how AI, how algorithmic systems can contribute to inequality. Kathy O'Neill points to the fact that we need to be thinking about how algorithms and the way they affect people is a social justice issue. We've talked about inequality, so we've talked about the way that marginalized communities in particular are more negatively affected than other groups. We've talked about how we're seeing through the implementation of these kinds of systems differing levels of state accountability for people who are socially sorted, people who are already marginalized in different ways because of the kind of unjust and unequal societies we already live in. These systems are exacerbating that. We're seeing changing power dynamics as systems are introduced where it becomes almost impossible for people to find out in what way they're being risk assessed, in what way their data is being used. We're seeing in some cases, as the Arkansas example demonstrates, the removal of human discretion. So we see in that case an algorithmic system replacing the decision-making of a professional, of a nurse. We have to be thinking about to what extent this is creating disconnections between us, right? Between each other, between us as humans. And we're seeing that the law is not adequately protecting people. These systems are being challenged in court successfully. Other research that I've been doing has been looking at canceled systems in different places. And we're seeing that there are a number of successful legal challenges, but those challenges often occur after harm has happened, after people have been negatively affected. So we need to be thinking about, and we'll come back to these questions in our discussion, what is needed to advance more justice? What is needed to advance more just datafied futures? I mean, you're the people developing and thinking about systems. You're the people who are going to be working in these spaces and in these areas going forward. What do we need to do to ensure that we have more just datafied futures? What would a movement for data justice look like? What steps are required to get us there? So in order to be, I think, hopeful, I just wanted to end on a bit of a hopeful note. There's no shortage of ideas. There are a lot of people putting forward fantastic ideas about what we can and what we should be doing. We can work toward more reflexive data science. We can look toward and ensure that we have auditing across the lifespan of data systems. We can ensure, for example, and this is something that just came out yesterday by the Algorithmic Justice League, of which Joy Bulamwini, who we heard from earlier, leads and started. One of the things that they've stressed is the importance of third-party auditing, right? So ensuring that affected communities, ensuring that third parties, those civil society organizations have the ability and have the resources to do audits before systems are put in place. Rashida Richardson and others have called for mandatory public registries of where and how these systems are being used. Is something that governments should be doing. A range of groups have called for privacy commissioners and others to be resourced and empowered so they could preemptively investigate what's happening. There have been calls for more responsibility, accountability, and greater attention to impact. So, for example, the types of fraud detection systems I was talking about earlier, the kind of fraud detection systems that we've already seen lead to an enormous amount of harm in Australia and the United States. We should be able to have those who want to introduce similar systems elsewhere have to take account of the way in which similar systems have led to mass destruction. Others have pointed that we should be able to refuse, right? There should be areas where we as a society might decide the risk of harm is so great. For example, if people are going to be negatively affected in that they might be wrongly denied access to necessary medical support or income, then maybe those are areas where we decide we don't want automated systems. Ben Schneiderman has called for a national algorithmic safety board. Dan McCullen has argued for a reinvigoration of democratic processes and institutions to ensure the public can have more and a better say. There are calls for political mobilization, the need to work against a logic of austerity, one that sees, that places attention on punishment, right? There have been those that have called to challenge the normalization of these systems. So we could talk about that more in a minute, but this might be ensuring that the introduction of any new system would have to go through a series of democratic checks to ensure there's expanded scope of stakeholders who are at any decision-making table around these systems. So I will stop there, and then I'll open the floor to questions. But if we don't have questions right away, maybe we could have a discussion about what you think might be needed to advance more just datafied futures. What would a movement for data justice look like?
All right, thank you so much, Joanna.